Hey guys, Joe here. We're moving on to Tier 5, our emergency bags. These are kind of like Tier 4. They're built around a specific task, but that task is emergency preparedness. So it's way more complex, way more involved, so we're going to spend a lot more time on it, and it's way more important, potentially life-saving. So we're going to split this into two parts because we're going to talk a lot more about them than other tiers. In this first part, we're going to talk about the methodology behind emergency bags and kind of clear up some of the misinformation out there. And then in part two, we're going to go through piece by piece of my most important emergency bag, the one I'm most likely going to use, so I carry it the most often and I put the most time and effort into it, so you can see what we're going to talk about in actual practice for a real person, an everyday person. I'm nobody special, so this is just what I use to kind of give you an idea. Now, this is going to be an exception to the tier gear system philosophy. 1 through 4, it's all stuff we're carrying on us, stuff we're actually using. We're cutting down on the wasted time, space, and money by not carrying things that are just cool looking or things someone tells us to buy. We're going to cut down on the unnecessary redundancy that we don't really need in the everyday world. But when it comes to emergency bags, these are going to be well kitted out. These are going to be preloaded. We're not necessarily going to have them on our bodies at all times. We're not really going to be using them, hopefully, ever. So these are things that are going to be prepackaged at an entrance or exit to our home, put in a secure location in our vehicle if we're going to be away from home for a while. We always want to make sure they're in walking distance, so they're not quite the same as the rest of the tiered system, but they're invaluable. I think everyone should have some sort of emergency bag, no matter what they do, no matter where they are, or who they are, what they do for work. You want to have some sort of emergency bag with you within walking distance at a minimum. And it needs to be something you can actually access. You don't want it at home when you're at work, because if an emergency happens, you can't actually use the bag, so it's just dead weight. Now, the best way for me to help you is for you to help me by forgetting everything you think you know about emergency bags. A lot of it is really generalistic. It doesn't address any real problem, and that's not the way you want to go. Tsunamis, hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, civil unrest, nuclear disaster, they all have unique hazards, unique length of duration, lots of stuff that is very specific. No general kit can address any of them in any amount of a useful way. It's just junk. It won't actually help you survive, help you handle that emergency. So it's just not good enough. We want to make sure we're avoiding general kit lists. We want to make sure we're avoiding things like the 10 C's of survival. It's missing the most important C of all, care. A cloth saline needle and cargo tape are kind of useless if you're bleeding out from a major arterial bleed or some sort of bone protrusion or head injury, or you're dealing with pneumothorax from a bullet wound. First aid is far more important than anything on that list, and yet it's not on this list, and it calls itself a survivability list. Come on. Most of the stuff is crap. It's very good for selling products to a gullible audience. It's very good for getting engagement because it's very simplistic and easy to remember, but doesn't actually work under the stress of a real-world environment. The most important thing of any kit, but especially an emergency kit, is to keep it personal and keep it goal-focused. We want specific emergencies in mind, and we want to tailor it to our everyday life, what we can do and what we'll need to do when these emergencies arise. Avoid everything you think you know about emergency bags. Now, we can make sure that our emergency bag is goal-specific and specific to our lives by doing a risk assessment. You're going to sit down with a piece of paper and write down all the hazards that could impact you. Doesn't have to be in order, just write them down. Everything from small personal things like healthcare issues, diabetes, cardiac events, a bad back like I have, all the way up to major things like natural and man-made disasters. Get all of it out, just get it out of your head, and then we're going to go through and do a proper risk assessment for each bullet point. Let's say you're in Florida and you've got hurricanes on there. It should very well be on there. So now we're going to think about hurricanes. What is the impact versus the probability? Or to put it in another way, how badly is this going to affect me versus how likely is this to happen to me? And if you live in Florida, hurricanes, very big impact. It's going to potentially wipe out your community. If you're present, you could die from various things. Very important. And it's very probable because you live in Florida. It's a seasonal event. They happen every year. So that's something that's going to be moved over to a priority list. It's high impact, high probability, and it's something we can actually prepare for, be ready with a bag for. So that's going to go to a new list, a priority list, and we want to go through each bullet point and do that assessment. And we want to get at least 3 to 5 major emergencies that we're going to try to plan around. Now, there's certain emergencies that are very high impact and moderate to high probability. Let's think about getting hit by a drunk driver. Very high impact. You could die. And it's really not that improbable, depending on where you live, like a college town, party town, somewhere that's very high in tourists, you're very likely to come across drunk drivers. So it's very similar to a hurricane. High impact, semi-high probability, but can we prepare for it? Can a bag help address this issue? Not really. If you get broadsided at full speed, you're probably going to die instantly or very quickly after being struck. You're not going to be able to react. You're not going to be able to predict getting struck. And if you do get pinned in your car and you're able to survive, you may not be able to reach your gear in the first place. So unless you're healthy enough to self-extricate, a bag really isn't useful in a car accident scenario, specifically like a drunk driver broadsiding you, T-boning you. So it's not something that maybe should go onto our priority list, but that's going to be up to you. If it's something that happens all the time in your area and you think you can come out with a way to prepare for it, certainly feel free to put it on that list, but that's not really what we're focusing on. And we're definitely not focusing on things that are fantastical like zombie apocalypses. That's big impact, global disaster, but it's so improbable as in to be impossible, and you're not going to address a zombie apocalypse out of a small little bag. It's just not realistic, even if it were to somehow magically happen. So keep it focused on high impact, high probability, and things you can actually address, and get yourself at least 3 to 5 major emergencies that you can handle, be it heart attacks and diabetes, or wildfires, hurricanes, things like that. Now we're going to focus on that priority list, our big emergencies. How is this going to change based on where we are? That's the first thing you got to think about is location, location, location. An urban environment is going to change the way these events happen and evolve versus a rural environment. It's going to change how you're able to address them versus a different environment. So let's say you're in a city and a riot breaks out. That's a terrible place to be during a riot. A lot of people very easily can get out of hand, it can grow. There's not a lot of avenues for escape because there's a lot of choke points because of the density of people and the narrowness of escape paths and the linear nature of most escape paths. It's not a very good place to be. Now, if you're in a rural environment and a riot breaks out, it's really not big of a deal. You just step aside and not get involved. Whether it's people raiding a grocery store or a bar fight that got out of hand, it's much easier to address a riot or a public outburst, civil unrest in a rural environment than it is the city. So where you are really impacts how that disaster will evolve and how you can address that disaster. So really think about it. And if you have to transition between two, let's say your house is in a wildfire zone, but you're working in a safe zone, and your kids are home and they don't know how to get away, you can't get a hold of them, maybe you have to go from the city into the danger zone to try to address them. So you got to think about that as well. This is not something we want to just spend 5 minutes on. You really want to think about the nitty-gritty of your emergency situations and how your location can play a role. You also got to think about seasonal variability. Certain emergencies are more likely to happen during certain seasons than others. For example, here in the winter, civil unrest really isn't that big of a deal. It's way too cold, way too snowy. People just don't care enough about the big issues to go riot in the winter. That's not to say it doesn't happen or it can't happen, but it's way less likely to happen than the first nice week of summer where gang violence and shootings and stabbings and all sorts of protests turn into riots here in upstate New York, specifically my area just outside of Rochester, Syracuse, and Buffalo. It's something we always expect when the weather gets nice. So seasons can have a huge influence, again, on the emergency itself and your response to that emergency. And even if you live in a more temperate area where you don't have all 4 classical seasons, there might still be things that are seasonally variable, like growing seasons, pest seasons, like cicadas or grasshoppers and whatever, the plagues. There's lots of things that can vary throughout the year, even if you're in a temperate area that doesn't experience all 4 of the classical seasons of spring, summer, fall, and winter. Think about how things change throughout the year, not just the location and not just the disaster itself. Now that we have all of that in mind, we've got our top 3, top 5, we've thought about location, we thought about how it can change over seasonal variation throughout the year, and we're going to be prepared for that. Now we can actually start packing up our bag. And there's 3 kind of emergency bags we can talk about, but we're going to focus on 2. So the big 3 are going to be our bug out bags or escape and evasion bags, our shelter-in-place bags, or SIP bags for those of you that like acronyms, and then rescue bags. Rescue bags are more unique because it's about approaching a disaster. You're putting yourself in harm's way specifically to help out your community. These are for first responders, people who are trained and equipped to handle disasters. The random average Joe should not be focusing on going to be a rescuer because they're just going to become another casualty and be in the way of first responders. Unless you can actually add value, you're truly trained and equipped, you should not be dealing with rescue ideology, rescue equipment. You should be focusing on the other 2 because that's where it's going to be the most good and you're not going to cause more harm. So when it comes to bug out bags, these are the most popular but the most misunderstood. The whole point of bugging out or escape and evasion is that you can see the disaster, you can see the danger, and you're running away. You're not trying to, go into the woods and set up a semi-permanent shelter. You're not trying to outlive nuclear winter or any of that crap. A bug out bag is that there's an immediate threat, there's an immediate danger, I can see it coming, I'm getting the heck out of here. I'm going from A to B or C, wherever the safe location is. And you do want to have a predetermined set of safe locations that are going to be outside the range of your predicted disaster. Here I have 3 major safe locations: a home alpha, a home beta, and a home delta. Not everyone is going to have that. I'm very fortunate. But you can do something similar to that. Ask your friends and family, whoever's in your preparedness network or your social circle, your tribe, see if you can work out agreements with one another where if something happens in this area, we all respond to this location or the other location. Try to work together as a survival preparedness community for emergency preparedness. The lone wolf always dies. This idea of the mountain man that's always on his own, he can brave everything, is a lie. It's a fiction. Mountain men in the real world, back in history, always had to come back to the city. Lone people on homesteads had to interact with other people in order to get the goods they needed. No one is living on an island all by themselves forever. It does not work. Make a network, make a community, and designate places for you to run to. Because if you don't have a bug out location, a bug out bag is pretty useless. Now, with the bug out bag, we are running away, so we want it to be as mobile as possible. We want to cut weight as much as possible. We still want the essentials, but we don't want to be carrying 50 to 100 pounds of gear because that's going to really slow us down. And now with shelter in place bags, it's kind of the opposite. Now, this is a situation where the dangers happen unpredictably, like an earthquake, or you weren't able to escape in time. Now you need to sit where you are. A shelter-in-place bag is going to be much heavier, much bulkier, because you're going to need to be where you are for much longer. You're going to have to brave the disaster for much longer. Whereas a bug-out bag, you should hopefully get where you're going within 24 to 48 hours. And a shelter-in-place situation, it could be 72 hours. It could be a week. It could be 2 weeks. So you're going to be carrying very similar items, but much more of them, and focusing less on mobility and more on innate protection, burying in, and being safe until first responders get you, or until the danger finally passes. Now, the general kit list is going to be, again, very similar between these bags, but in different amounts. And you want to think about how we pack these bags based on what can kill you the fastest. And obviously, the fastest thing that can kill you in seconds to minutes is a healthcare crisis. Allergic reactions, bullet wounds, lots of various things like diabetes mismanagement, heart attacks. We need to be able to address our healthcare concerns first and foremost. So our first thing that we're going to spend all the time on, most of our resources on initially, should be a proper first aid trauma kit. Don't just copy what someone else has. Actually think about the emergency and the gear you're equipped and able to use in that emergency with your current skill set. If you want to carry something more complex, you need to get the training to do that. Don't just put it in your kit and expect to figure it out, because you can easily kill yourself or someone else by misusing tools like decompression needles and intubation equipment. You need to really have first-hand, properly certified and licensed trainers to learn how to use that correctly. Even medical professionals avoid using decompression needles because of how hard and how complex they can be. You, the average person, should not be touching them at all if you haven't had supervised training. So we really want to focus on first aid. Bleeds and other healthcare conditions can kill us right away. That's what we want to focus on, whether it's bug out or sheltering in place. Now, what can kill us in a matter of hours? That's exposure. And so we automatically go to shelter and staying warm, but that's not the whole scenario. What if you're in a desert? For part of the day, it's going to be really, really hot. You need a way to cool down. You need a way to be protected from the sun. It's not all about staying warm in those cold desert nights. You got to think about your specific location and seasonal variability and address your shelter to that. It's not always about staying warm. It's about exposure, extreme heat and extreme cold. And you really got to focus in on that. We don't want to cut any corners. We don't want to spend only 5 minutes on this. Really think about, in this location, at this time of year, how will this typically play out? You can look at historical data on your weather. You can look at different things about how humidity changes throughout the day for that area. If you're new to that area, if you're going to a desert environment especially, I suggest you do a lot of research on that area and how things change, not just throughout the seasons, but how it goes throughout the day, because there are going to be stark differences. There's a lot that goes into preparing for exposure, and it's a very, very common cause of death. Exposure kills more people than pretty much any other natural disaster that occurs in the world. It's really big, really important. Again, almost as important as immediate healthcare crises. You really want to focus on exposure care, sheltering, and dealing with extreme heat and extreme cold. Next on our list is going to be dehydration. The typical rule of thumb is 3 days, but that's not accurate. After day 2, you're going to be in pretty bad shape and probably die regardless. So you really want to make sure you're able to get water. Make sure you're able to procure it from the environment and hopefully be able to filter it out. But there's a lot of things you need to think about with filtering. It's better to drink water without a filter than not drink water at all. It's better to crap your pants but still be alive when you're found than be found dead next to a pool of water that you were too arrogant to drink. So you got to remember, hydration is more important than sanitation, but you still want to do your best to sanitize. And there's certain things that can impact sanitization. Things like chemical toxins and heavy metals, most filters on the market are not going to be able to address them. They can handle pathogens great, things like Grails and Sawyers. That'll be handling your viruses, your bacteria, and your protozoa, but they won't necessarily handle the heavy metal toxins, the chemical toxins in a water supply. So you still need to think, especially in an urban environment, what could be in this water, and can I get my water from somewhere else? Even the clean water in an urban environment isn't necessarily good, but at least that water will probably not have the toxins that can't be filtered out of your water. Now, you do need to understand heavy metals and chemicals usually take a long time to affect, but if you're right near the source, a very high concentration of them, it could kill you in a matter of days, if not even sooner, depending on what that chemical agitation or toxin really is. So just think about the minority things that could be rare but could still be in the area, especially if you're in an urban environment. For example, in Rochester, silver is a big problem in the Genesee River. So I wouldn't want to be doing my best to chug out of this Genesee River. I'd want to go to puddles and things like that. Off of that, we also have to think about food. Now, most people go immediately to food for some reason. I think it's just a psychological thing, but it's really not that important, especially in a bug out scenario. You can live 72 hours just fine without actual food. What you really need is electrolytes. So carrying things like liquid IV, carrying sugar sticks that help you absorb electrolytes. Sugar itself isn't an electrolyte, but it helps your body take in electrolytes and properly use them. The sugar, caffeine helps keep you awake, keep you alert from making mistakes. You really don't need a lot of calories for a bug out bag, but a shelter in place bag, calories are king. You really want to focus on high calorie foods to make sure you're maintaining yourself during a long scale issue. Again, it could be 72 hours or it could be 2 weeks in certain long-term shelter-in-place disasters. Think of Hurricane Katrina and things like that. Food becomes more important the longer you're going to be out. For a bug-out bag, not as important, but maybe you could throw a lifeboat ration or one of those survival packs in there just in case. You never know when a bug-out can become a shelter-in-place or vice versa. Sometimes you need to be able to do both. Now, the next thing I think is important beyond the 4 big ones is mobility, especially for a bug out bag. If you're trying to go from A to B, you need to make sure you can keep going from A to B. If your shoe blows out or it gets wet or destroyed or there's something that really injures your ability to walk, maybe you want to have some sort of knee brace, an ankle brace, and things beyond your typical first aid kit to address mobility. A spare pair of socks, a spare pair of shoes even. Protective shoes for certain types of material. There are nails and broken glass that can go through sandals and basic shoes we might be wearing on the everyday. Maybe we want to keep a pair of steel toes in our emergency bag just in case. Yeah, we're trying to cut down on weight for bug out, but it's worth its weight if it can help us keep going where we're going. Now, in a shelter-in-place bag, mobility isn't as important. Again, we're sheltering in place, but again, like I said, you might have to leave. You might have to run away from that sheltering in place because the situation changed. So you should still think about how you can stay mobile even in a shelter-in-place environment. Now, regardless of what you're carrying, you should always have a pack list. You should make sure you're going through expiration dates for first aid and food equipment. And we're going to run through all of that stuff in part 2, which is next. We're going to go through my bag, show off my personal list, and go through every item and why I personally carry it. It's all fine and dandy to understand that we need to make a risk assessment, understand how location and weather affect it, understand the difference between a bug out bag for running away, understand a shelter in place bag for being where we need to be in an emergency. But how does that actually turn out in the real world? What does that actually look like? We're going to talk about that. So until the next one, stay safe, stay informed, and remember to tell someone you love them. Kindness is in short supply. Misinformation is everywhere. Everyone's trying to be angry for the sake of being angry. A little smile, a little I love you, Mom, a little anything can really help a lot of people in these dark times. So see you in the next one, guys.